The listing said no pets, no smoking, utilities included, and Marcus Webb had exactly 48 hours before his landlord changed the locks on his old place. He took the room. He didn't even ask why the previous tenant had left in a hurry. He didn't ask why the ad had been up for 11 days in a housing market where decent rooms in Portland vanished in 11 minutes. He asked about the parking situation and whether the Wi-Fi could handle streaming, and when the answer to both was yes, he signed the digital lease with his thumb on a phone screen and handed over a first month's check before the doubt could catch up with him. The apartment was a converted Victorian on the north side, one of those old houses cut into 4 units sometime in the 80s by a landlord who had almost certainly violated several city ordinances doing it. 3rd floor, rear-facing, with a clawfoot tub someone had painted over 3 times and a kitchen window that looked directly into the fire escape. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. 1 common room that smelled faintly of something Marcus couldn't name, not mold, not old cooking, not any of the usual apartment ghosts. Something older than any of that. Something like the air at the bottom of a very old well. He figured it would air out. He had been in worse places. His first apartment out of school had been a basement unit on a busy street, where the walls wept condensation from October to March, and the upstairs neighbor had 3 dogs and a habit of rearranging furniture at 2 a.m. He had lived there for 2 years because the rent was $300 less than anything comparable, and $300 in his mid-20s was the difference between making rent and not. He had a higher tolerance for imperfect living conditions than most people his age, and he had decided, somewhere in his early 20s, that spending energy on domestic dissatisfaction was energy he could spend on other things. He spent it on vinyl. He spent it on the show. His roommate was already there when he moved in, which he had been told to expect. The ad had said existing tenant, quiet, professional, odd hours. What it had not said was that she stood exactly 6'2" in bare feet, that her skin was the color of old ivory, that her eyes were the precise amber of honey held up to a lamp, and that she watched him drag his amp and his crates of vinyl up the stairs with an expression of such absolute stillness that it took him 3 trips before he realized she hadn't blinked once. "Marcus," he said, offering his hand. "Vel," she said, and took it. Her grip was firm. Her hand was cold in the way that hands only get when there's no warmth underneath trying to push through, not the cold of a person who'd been outside. The cold of a person whose core temperature was simply different from his, calibrated to something other than the biological norm he'd spent his whole life assuming was universal. "Short for something." "Yes," she said, and that was the end of that. She kept the odd hours the ad had promised. He never saw her in the morning. He sometimes heard her in the kitchen after 2 a.m., not cooking, just moving, the soft, deliberate sound of someone who has had decades of practice being quiet and is only quiet by choice. She had a single shelf of books in the common room, nothing in English. Scripts he didn't recognize, spines worn soft, the kind of worn that wasn't age but repetition. She read them the way people read religious texts, not for information, but to stay connected to something. He could tell the difference because the books had no urgency to them. She did not lean forward when she read, did not turn pages fast. She held the books the way you hold something that has always been there, and you are simply confirming it. He was a late-night internet radio host. WXNR, streaming only, 2,000 listeners on a good night, 98% of whom he had never met and never would. He did a show called The Deep Channel, 2 hours of deep cuts, obscure pressings, the records that fell through cracks in history and were the better for it. He broadcast from the 2nd bedroom, a room he'd insulated with moving blankets and foam tiles and a compression mic he'd been paying off for 3 years. The room smelled of electronics and old paper and the specific dust that lives in vinyl grooves, which Marcus thought was the best smell in the world. He did the show Tuesday and Thursday nights, 11 to 1. He'd done it for 4 years from 3 different apartments, always with the same setup, always the same opener. A 15-second burst of feedback that his regular listeners called the dive, because it sounded like something going under. He'd never intended it as a brand. He'd done it the first night because he was nervous and hit the wrong switch, and then the response from listeners had been so immediate and specific. Yes, that exactly that, do it every time, that it became the thing. That was how the show had always worked. Accidents that stuck. Moments that shouldn't have been beautiful but were. He kept the volume low when he wasn't broadcasting. Headphones mostly. He was considerate about it, which was not a thing he was overly precious about, but which he thought was basic human decency in a shared living situation, and which he maintained as a matter of principle regardless of whether the other person in the space seemed to care. Vel never complained about the noise. Vel never complained about anything. She also never offered anything, no stories about her day, no opinions about the weather, no reactions to any of the normal friction of shared space. She moved through the apartment the way water moves through stone, finding the path of least resistance and taking it, leaving no mark. When they were in the kitchen at the same time, which happened rarely, and only in the late evening when he was making dinner, and she was in the space for reasons he couldn't identify, since she never ate, she moved around him with a precision that suggested she had calculated exactly where he was going to be before he knew himself. It was 2 weeks before Marcus noticed that the people on the second floor had started looking tired. Not sick, not sad, just depleted. The woman in 2A, a hospice nurse named Deanna who Marcus had waved at maybe 6 times, started having trouble with her keys. She'd stand at her door for 30 seconds longer than she should have needed to, not confused exactly, but moving with less certainty than before, as if her own body had become slightly unreliable. The couple in 2B, whose arguments he could sometimes hear through the floor, the particular rhythm of 2 people who had lived together long enough that their fights had structure, stopped arguing. Not because things got better, but because they seemed to have stopped having the energy for it. The old man in 2C, whom Marcus had once seen carry a full bookcase up the stairs alone, cursing cheerfully the whole way, started taking the elevator. He told himself it was seasonal, February in Portland, light deprivation, collective burnout. The entire city operated at a deficit of vitamin D for 5 months out of every year, and this produced predictable effects on the population. He told himself this for another 10 days. Then he found the marks. He wasn't looking for them. He was fixing a bracket on his studio shelf, and the screwdriver slipped, and the shelf came down, and he cut his palm on the edge, and stood there in his studio dripping blood on the floor saying words his mother would not have approved of. And Vel knocked on his door. She'd never knocked before, and opened it without waiting for an answer. She looked at his hand. She took 1 step forward. Then she stopped. She stopped the way an animal stops when it steps on ice and doesn't know yet if it will hold. Every muscle paused. Her nostrils flared just slightly, barely perceptible, but he was standing 4 feet away and he saw it. She was smelling his blood, not a metaphor, not an impression. Her nostrils actually widened, and her chin lifted fractionally, and she was processing information with her nose the way he processed information with his eyes. And then her expression did something he couldn't quite classify. Not disgust, not disappointment. The closest he could come to it afterward was the face a person makes when they reach for a light switch and the power's out. A recalibration, an adjustment to new information. The look of a very competent being encountering a variable they had not accounted for and filing it correctly without wasted time. "You're bleeding," she said. "Yeah," he said, "Shelf got me." "Do you need assistance?" It wasn't quite a question. Questions have a small lift at the end. This was flat, declarative, a line spoken from a script she'd memorized long ago for situations that required social simulation. She had probably said it hundreds of times to hundreds of humans in hundreds of shared living situations. She had probably found that it was the correct thing to say when a human was hurt. Offer something. Make the offer with the right cadence. Proceed from there based on the response. "I'm fine," he said. "I've got a first aid kit." "Good," she said. She backed out of the doorway. He stood there for a moment with his bleeding hand and his knocked-over shelf, and the very particular feeling of a conversation that had told him something he didn't have words for yet. He stood there and breathed and watched the blood bead on his palm and thought about the step she had taken, and the way she had stopped in the middle of it, and what the stopping meant. He bandaged his hand. He went back to the common room. He looked at Vel's shelf of unreadable books, and then he did what Marcus Webb always did when he needed to know something. He started paying attention. He began logging. Nothing dramatic, just notes in his phone, time stamps. What he saw: the second-floor tenants and their creeping exhaustion. Vel's hours, out before dusk, back after midnight without exception. He confirmed this over 9 consecutive days, standing at his kitchen window on the fire escape side, watching the building entrance from above. She left between 5 and 6 in the evening, depending on the sunset. She returned between 12:30 and 2, never before, never after. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The pattern was a schedule, and schedules existed for reasons. He logged the fact that she didn't eat. He'd been sharing a kitchen with her for a month and had never once seen her cook, never once seen a food delivery, never once found a dish she'd used in the rack. He had assumed at first that she ate out, or ate at work, or had some other arrangement that simply didn't involve the shared kitchen. But now he began to think of her absence from eating the way he thought about signal gaps in his broadcast chain, not neutral but meaningful. The absence of something where something should be. He logged the cold. Her room ran noticeably colder than the rest of the apartment even when the radiator was working. He'd assumed faulty pipes. Now he was less sure. He found the marks on the 3rd day of looking. He found them because he went looking for them, because he had already decided that the step she'd taken and stopped was not the step of someone checking on an injured person. He found them because he walked every public hallway in the building and looked at every doorframe. He was casual about it, the way you're casual when you're checking for something specific and don't want anyone to notice. He walked with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the floors and the ceilings and the walls. He moved like a person who was just comfortable in his building, and not like a person conducting a search. Deanna's doorframe. Low down at knee height, 2 small curved indentations in the wood, almost like puncture marks from something very thin and very sharp, spaced about 6 centimeters apart. He wouldn't have noticed except the finish was slightly different around them, discolored the way wood gets when something organic sits against it over time, when there's contact repeated enough to leave chemistry behind. He stepped back. He looked at the door across the hall, 2B. Same thing. Different height but same configuration. 2 small marks, same spacing, same discoloration. 2C. Same. He looked at the first-floor units. No marks. He looked at his own door, 3rd floor, Unit 3A. He had to get low to check the angle. Nothing. He looked at 3B, which was Vel's unit. Nothing. Because she didn't need to mark her own door, and she didn't need to mark his because she couldn't use him. He stood in the stairwell for a full minute not moving, looking at the architectural detail of an old Victorian being cut into 4 units, and the very specific physical evidence that something had been touching those door frames regularly, from outside, at the height, where something moving on all 4s or crouching very low would make contact. Then he went back upstairs to his apartment and sat down at his broadcast desk and did not turn on the mic. He just sat. He looked at his notes. He looked at the dates the second-floor tenants had started declining. He mapped it back to when Vel had moved in 8 months ago before him. He looked at the marks in his memory, curved, thin, like the tips of something designed to make contact without breaking, without tearing, without leaving any wound that would be noticed. He thought about her hand, the cold of it, the cold that was calibrated to something other than mammalian warmth. He thought about how she'd stopped dead in his doorway when she smelled his blood, and then backed away. He thought incompatible, not a deterrent, not something she feared, something she couldn't use, like trying to run a car on the wrong fuel. It wasn't dangerous, it simply didn't work. The engine didn't damage itself, it just didn't fire. His blood was the wrong type for her, which meant he was the only person in the building who was safe. Which meant he was the only person in the building who was capable of knowing. He did the Tuesday show. He had 2,000 listeners, some of them regulars who'd been with him since year one, people who had told him the show helped them through insomnia, through grief, through the specific modern loneliness of being awake when the rest of your city was asleep. There was a woman who emailed him from Tacoma every few months to tell him which track had saved her on which particular night. There was a retired firefighter in Boise who had never once sent an email but had called in twice, both times past midnight, just to say that the show was the best thing on the air and that Marcus should keep going. He could not bail on them because his life had gotten strange. He did the show, and it was the best show he'd done in months because terror, he discovered, was clarifying. When there was something large and real and present pressing at the edges of your awareness, the small things you normally wasted attention on fell away, and what remained was the core of the thing you loved. He played Ennio Morricone and Arthur Russell and a Coltrane bootleg from '64, and a piece of electronic music that had never had a name, just a catalog number, from a label that had lasted 18 months in Berlin in 1981. He talked between tracks the way he always did, not much, just enough to hold the space, to make the silence mean something rather than just sit there being absence. His voice was level. His hands were steady. He was performing calm so well that calm almost came. After the show, he sat in the dark and made a list. He was not a soldier. He was not a scientist. He was not a government agent or a monster hunter or anyone who had ever been in any situation remotely like this. He was a 31-year-old record collector with a broadcast license, a first aid kit, and an apartment he couldn't afford to leave because his security deposit was tied up until June, and the next cheapest option in his budget was a room above a bar in a neighborhood with 3 times the commute. He thought, what do I actually know? Not what do I suspect, not what do I fear, what do I know? He knew she fed on humans, specifically on their blood, or something in their blood, or something she extracted through proximity and contact without the kind of obvious violence that would get noticed. He knew she fed subtly, below the threshold of awareness, in a way that left the victim depleted rather than dead. He knew she was careful. She had been in this building for 8 months before he moved in, and none of the second-floor tenants had collapsed or gone to a hospital or made any report of anything unusual. She managed her feeding the way a careful farmer manages a field. She didn't want to damage her food supply. She wanted it to keep producing. He knew she operated on a schedule, out before dusk, back after midnight, which meant daytime was his. He knew she was old. He didn't know how old, but there was something in the way she moved, not stiffness, the opposite of stiffness, the precision of a body that had had centuries to learn exactly how much effort each motion required, and had eliminated all the rest, that suggested a span of time longer than anything he wanted to think about directly or at length. Old in the way that bedrock is old. Old in the way that something predates the categories you'd use to describe it. He knew she couldn't feed from him. He knew she knew that. What he didn't know was whether she considered him a problem. He had been living beside her for a month, and she had been, as advertised, quiet and professional and maintaining odd hours. She had not done anything that could be read as threatening. She had, in fact, in her own specific way, been a reasonably considerate roommate, in that she did not impose, did not play music loudly, did not leave messes, and had once without comment replaced the dish soap when it ran out. He did not know whether that consideration was genuine or strategic. He did not know if there was a difference to something like her. He started researching. Not mythology. Mythology was noise, accumulated folklore that had been wrong about more things than it had been right about, filtered through centuries of human terror and desire, and the tendency to make symbols out of things that frightened them. He went looking for patterns instead. Actual data. Missing person reports in neighborhoods where she might have lived before. Health anomalies. Communities that had quietly gotten tired without explanation. He found 3 clusters over 18 months, in 3 different cities on the West Coast. The pattern in each city was the same: a period of increasing fatigue reports among residents of a specific building or block, followed by a period of gradual recovery, with no documented cause. The recovery period in each case began approximately 2 months after the cluster started, as if something had moved on. Portland was city number 4. She had probably done this for longer than the internet existed to document it. He thought, she's not a monster, she's a predator. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Monsters destroy, predators optimize. A monster burns the field, a predator tends it. Which was, in its way, worse, because it meant she wasn't going to do anything so dramatic and stupid as attack him. She was going to continue what she was doing, carefully and sustainably, for as long as the field remained viable. Then she would move, and the building would quietly recover, the way the previous buildings had quietly recovered, and no one would ever know why. Unless someone paid attention. Unless someone was in the right place with the wrong blood type and the specific habit of listening to things other people didn't notice. Thursday night he did the show again, and it was during a long instrumental track, 42 minutes, a private press album a listener had mailed him from Osaka, a record with no artist name and no label information, just a hand-drawn cover of something that might have been a wave or might have been a mountain, that he found the thing by accident. He'd been testing signal configurations. He did this sometimes when he had a long track playing, adjusting his broadcast chain, looking for interference, trying to clean up the signal in the high frequencies where digital compression liked to introduce artifacts that sounded like silk tearing. He was running a spectrum analyzer on his laptop and half watching it while he thought about Vel and the second floor, and what he was actually going to do about any of this. The spectrum analyzer showed his broadcast signal, clean across the range, and then, overlapping, bleeding in from somewhere, another signal. Not broadcast, not cellular, not anything he'd seen before on that range. It was in a frequency band that shouldn't have anything in it, a gap in the allocation, the kind of space regulators left empty because nothing useful had ever been built to use it. It pulsed. He watched it pulse, irregular but rhythmic, like breathing, like the slow underwater beat of something very large staying very still. He pulled up a second analyzer on his other laptop and isolated it. Started recording. The signal was being broadcast from somewhere very close, within the building, almost certainly, given the signal's strength and the fact that there was no degradation of the kind that indicated distance traveled. Short range, low power, the kind of signal you'd use if you weren't trying to reach far but trying to reach specific. Like echolocation. Like a bat in a cave, not broadcasting to the world but reading the world that was immediately around it. He sat very still with both laptops open in front of him, and the Osaka record playing and 42 minutes of instrumental music keeping him on air while he stared at a frequency that shouldn't exist. He thought about echolocation. He thought about how bats use ultrasound not to communicate but to map space, to build a three-dimensional picture of the environment from the echoes of their own signal. He thought about a predator who had been doing what she did for what was probably centuries. She would need to know her environment, not just visually, deeply. At the level of biology, she would need to know what was in each room of a building without opening every door. She would need to know the state of the people around her, their health, their proximity, their biology, whether they were sleeping or waking, whether the chemistry of their blood was at the level she required. She was broadcasting a signal that let her monitor the building's inhabitants from her room. The same way his show broadcast music into the night, she broadcast a field that read the people around her. Their presence, their states, maybe their blood composition, the things about them that told her when to feed and how much to take and when to stop. And that signal was bleeding into his broadcast band because he was running equipment sensitive enough to detect it, equipment built to find signal in noise, equipment that had cost him 3 months of savings and 4 years of careful use. He almost laughed. He put his fist over his mouth and pressed until the almost laugh subsided, because he was on air and 2,000 people were listening to the Osaka record, and whatever sounds the mic picked up in the background, and he was not going to explain this. He was the only person in the building who could hear her. And she had no idea. He finished the show. He said goodnight to his listeners the way he always did, quiet, personal, stay warm out there, meaning it the way he always meant it, which was genuinely and without irony, and he sat in the silence afterward and let the thing he'd found settle into its correct position in the rest of what he knew. He thought, I am a man who runs a signal into the night and hopes someone on the other end is listening. I have learned, over 4 years of doing this, that signals travel in both directions, that the act of putting something out there changes the person putting it out, that you cannot broadcast without being changed by the act of broadcasting, that frequencies interact. That interference is not always destruction. Sometimes interference is the whole point. He started building. He had the equipment because of the show. He had the knowledge because of the show, 4 years of learning broadcast physics out of necessity, of troubleshooting interference problems, of understanding how signals work together and against each other. He spent 3 days pulling apart and reconfiguring things. A second amp, a directional antenna array he'd built from parts for a range extension project 2 years ago that he'd never finished, a frequency modulator he'd bought online for $30 and used exactly once. He worked during the days when she was out. He slept in 3-hour blocks. He ate whatever was in the kitchen, whatever he had without much attention to what it was. He stopped answering texts except from his engineer friend Tyrell, who texted every few days anyway and would notice an unusually long silence. He told Tyrell he was working on a project. Tyrell said cool and sent him a meme about frequency modulation that was either a coincidence or the universe making a joke. What he was building was not a weapon. He was very clear with himself about this because clarity mattered when you were making something with physical consequences in the real world. A weapon was something designed to damage. What he was building was a mirror. A system that would take her signal, analyze its structure, and reflect it back at a modified frequency. Not strong enough to hurt, not designed to cause pain, but calibrated specifically to create interference in the coherence she depended on to read the building. He knew this because he had spent 72 hours studying her signal the way he would study a record, listening for its structure, its rhythm, the way it breathed, the way it used the space between its pulses as much as the pulses themselves. He understood it the way he understood music, not intellectually, not in a detached analytical way, but in his chest, in the place behind the sternum where the good music lives, where something resonates rather than just being heard. He could feel the pattern of it the way he could feel the timing of a great drummer, and because he could feel it, he could counter it. Her signal was a sonar pulse. His was a broadcast. He was going to jam hers with his. Not permanently, not to destroy, not to hurt. To be very specific, he was going to make the building too noisy for her to read. He was going to make every room in it a mystery to her, so that she could no longer map her food supply, so that she could no longer feed with the precision she depended on. A predator who cannot be careful has 2 choices: leave or escalate. And escalating meant drawing attention, meant doing something visible, meant breaking the pattern of careful, sustainable management that had kept her doing this for however long she had been doing it. He was betting on leave. He spent the 4th day writing out everything he knew, all of it, In a document he encrypted with a password and backed up to 3 locations: a cloud drive, a USB key he kept on his person, and an email draft he'd send to Tyrell's address with a note attached explaining what to do with it if Marcus stopped responding to texts. He wrote down the names of the cities, the dates, the signal frequency and its characteristics, and the equipment he'd built to counter it. Everything he understood about how she worked. He wrote in plain language, not technical language, because he did not know who would eventually read it. He thought about leaving a note for the second-floor tenants. He drafted it 3 times. Each draft was more impossible than the last. He could not explain what was happening to them in any language that would be believed. He could not tell Deanna, "Your fatigue is because your alien vampire roommate has been feeding on you for 8 months." He could not tell the couple in 2B, "Stop fighting, it won't help. The fight isn't the problem." He deleted all 3 drafts. Instead, he knocked on Deanna's door on a Wednesday afternoon when she was home between shifts. She answered in her scrubs, home from a morning rotation, and she looked tired the way people in their second month of February looked tired, with the particular worn quality of someone who had been giving more than they were taking in for long enough that the deficit was becoming structural. "Hey," Marcus said, "I just wanted to, I don't know, check in. You seem like you've been having a rough stretch." Deanna looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person who hadn't been asked about themselves in a while, and whom the question therefore hit with slightly more force than was comfortable. "I've been kind of off," she said. "Low energy. I thought it was just the season." "You should maybe see a doctor," Marcus said. "Get some blood work done. Sometimes it's something simple, iron levels, B12, whatever, worth having documented." She looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "maybe." "I'm serious," he said. "Don't put it off. I think it would help to have the numbers." She promised she would, with the hesitant sincerity of someone making a promise they hadn't planned to make and weren't entirely sure they would keep. He thanked her and left. It was the only thing he could give her right now, a nudge toward documentation, toward someone with the authority and the instruments to notice something. He went back upstairs and finished the array. He tested it carefully, very carefully, because he was not an engineer and he had improvised most of this from parts that had not been designed to work together, and the last thing he needed was to destroy his broadcast equipment and lose the show. He also tested for collateral interference, anything that might affect medical equipment, anything that might create problems for the building's electrical systems. The signal he generated was narrowband, targeted, low power. He ran a 15-minute test with everything else off in the apartment, just sitting in his studio in the quiet and watching the interaction on the spectrum analyzer. Her signal came in. His signal reflected it. On the analyzer, the result looked like 2 waves hitting each other in a tank, neither destroyed, but neither coherent after the collision. The interaction produced a third pattern, a standing wave that was neither of them, a static specific to the frequency that would make the building impossible to read from any single point within it, like trying to use echolocation in a room full of irregular surfaces. The returns would come back meaningless. He turned it off. He sat in the quiet for a long time. He thought about his listeners. He thought about the woman in Tacoma and the retired firefighter in Boise, and the thousands of people he had never met who found something they needed in a signal he put into the world on Tuesday and Thursday nights. He thought about the first night he'd done the show, so nervous he'd hit the wrong switch and produced 15 seconds of feedback before he got his hands under control, and how that accident had become the thing he was known for. The dive. The sound of going under before the music comes up. He thought, "I do this because signals matter, because what you put into the frequency doesn't disappear, because someone is always listening, and the act of listening changes both of you, the sender and the receiver, the signal and whatever it meets." He turned it on. He did not do this dramatically. He didn't have any ritual about it, no speech, no ceremony. He just flipped the switch the way you'd turn on a room light and then sat back in his chair and waited. For 2 days, nothing seemed different on the surface of things. On the third day, he heard sounds in her room that he hadn't heard before. Not threatening sounds, not violence. The sound of drawers opened and closed with careful deliberation. The sound of things being moved, considered, packed. The sound of a person, a being, reevaluating a situation and reaching a conclusion about the best path forward. She came out of her room at 7 in the evening, which was unprecedented. Full daylight still in the February sky, gray and flat and persistent. The kind of sky that never quite gets dark in winter, just becomes a different shade of dark. She was dressed in clothes he'd never seen her wear, which meant she'd gone somewhere and bought them. A long coat, dark, functional, the kind of coat a person buys when they are planning to cover significant ground. She was carrying 2 bags, not large ones, the kind you could move fast with. She stopped in the common room doorway when she saw him. He was sitting on the couch. He had his phone in his lap. He was not doing anything except waiting, which he had been doing since he turned the array on, and which he had known would eventually look exactly like this. The 2 of them in the common room, his equipment running in the studio behind the closed door, her bags by her feet. They looked at each other. He thought 6'2", old as anything, could probably be across the room and through a wall before I finished standing up, could probably do whatever she wanted and leave nothing behind worth investigating, could probably leave a much larger mess than she has if she decided the calculation had changed. He also thought she doesn't want to. Because she was careful, because she was a conservationist. Because she had spent a very long time maintaining a very specific kind of invisible existence, and killing the one person in the building who knew what she was would create exactly the kind of attention that invisible existences could not survive. A missing person, an investigation, eyes on this building, eyes on her. She didn't want that. She never had. "You built something," she said. "I did," he said. "It interferes with my orientation system." "I know." She tilted her head the way she'd done in his studio doorway, the small recalibration, the micro-adjustment. She was very still. The amber eyes moved across the room without her head moving, reading exit routes and threat levels and whatever else an ancient predator read in a contained space. "You are not afraid," she said. "I'm pretty scared, actually," Marcus said. "I'm just not going to let that drive." Something moved in her face, something so brief he almost missed it. Not quite surprise, not quite respect. The word that came to mind was consideration, the look of a being whose assessments of humans had been settled for a very long time, encountering one that didn't fit the previous data and updating accordingly, without waste, without drama. "Your blood," she said, "it's type O negative, universal donor." "So I've been told." "It disrupts my feeding chemistry. I cannot process it." She paused. The pause had the quality of something calibrated, long enough to carry weight, short enough not to be theatrical. "I noticed when you moved in." "I did not expect you to notice me." "I pay attention," Marcus said. "It's kind of my job." She looked at the studio door. The signs of occupation that leaked under it, the green light of a standby indicator, the faint hum of electronics that never fully slept. She looked at the shelf of vinyl, the amp, the little universe he had made of sound in a second-floor bedroom of a converted Victorian in Portland. "The radio program," she said. "The deep channel, Tuesday and Thursday, 11 to 1. "I have listened," she said, "from my room." He hadn't known that. He hadn't thought to wonder, which said something about the assumptions he carried into this, the limit of his own attention. He sat with the information for a moment. He thought about the nights he'd been sitting 4 feet away from her wall, putting music into the air, and she'd been on the other side of it, in the cold dark, with her old books in their unreadable scripts, listening. "Did you like it?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment, Something moved in the amber eyes that he couldn't classify. "The Coltrane," she said, "from 1964. "Bootleg recording," Marcus said. "Piano mic was blown. The bass comes through strange." "The imperfection is what makes it," she said. "The signal should not be beautiful, but it is." Marcus looked at her. He looked at her bags. He thought about Deanna and her keys. The couple in 2B who'd stopped arguing not from resolution but from depletion. The old man who'd stopped carrying things. He thought about the cities before Portland. The 3 clusters, the patterns, the long, careful management of a food supply she treated like a resource to be husbanded, not destroyed. He thought, I can't make that not have happened. I can't undo the months. I can't give those people back what she took. But I can make her leave. "I'll keep the array on," he said, "as long as you stay in this building." "I am aware," she said. "I'm going to tell everyone on the 2nd floor to get blood work done. Deanna already said she would. I'll check back with her." She was silent for a moment. "They will recover," she said. "The depletion is not permanent. The chemistry restores itself." "I know," he said, "but I want them to have documentation, a doctor's record. Numbers in a file somewhere." She looked at him with the amber eyes. She understood what he was doing. He was making a record, not of her specifically, not in a way that would expose her directly, not in a way that would blow the careful, invisible existence she had maintained across decades or centuries. Just a record of the effect. Just numbers in a file that said, these people were depleted and then they recovered, and here are the dates. A signal put into the world, addressed to whoever was listening. "You are very careful," she said, "for a human." "You're not the first person to say that," Marcus said, though most of them meant it as a complaint. Another flicker across her face. He was starting to be able to read the register. This one was something like wry, not quite humor, but the acknowledgement of a human being doing something human in a situation that had transcended human categories, and the acknowledgement landing with a specific quality that wasn't contempt. "The signal you built," she said. "It is narrowband, specific to my frequency." "Yes." "You could have broadcast on a wider band. It would have been simpler to build." "Wider band would have interfered with other equipment in the building," Marcus said. "Medical monitors, pacemakers, if anyone has one. I didn't know if anyone in the building had them, but I didn't want to find out the hard way." She was quiet again. The quiet was longer this time, and had a different quality than the previous quiet. Not the pause of something calibrating, but something closer to the pause of something absorbing. "I did not anticipate," she said finally, "a human whose first concern when confronting a predator was the impact of their countermeasure on third parties." "Well," Marcus said, "here we are." She picked up her bags. She moved toward the door with the same efficiency of motion he'd observed for the past months. No wasted step, no hesitation, the movement of something that had decided. She stopped with her hand on the knob and stood there for a moment in the particular way of a very old being who was not accustomed to endings of this type, who had had many endings that were clean. She moved. The building recovered. The chapter closed, and was now in the middle of one that wasn't quite clean and was trying to determine how to conclude it correctly. "The Coltrane piece," she said without turning around. "The bootleg." "Yeah. You mentioned a listener had mailed it from Osaka." "Couple years ago," Marcus said. "Never found another copy." "I have seen one," she said. "In a private collection. I can send you the location if you want it." Marcus looked at her back, the long dark coat, the 2 bags, the hand on the doorknob. He thought about a lot of things in a short amount of time, the way the mind compresses when it needs to. He thought about the 2nd floor. He thought about the 4 cities. He thought about a being who had been doing what she did for what was probably centuries, who had made various calculations about humanity across those centuries and arrived at conclusions he might not endorse, and who was leaving right now because a 31-year-old record collector with a broadcast license and a specific blood type had found a way to make staying untenable. Which was a victory. Which was the whole point. The whole point was here, these people, this building, this moment. He also thought about a being who had been alone with her old books for a very long time, who had listened through a wall to his show on Tuesday and Thursday nights, who had identified the specific thing that made the Coltrane bootleg work, the imperfection, the blown mic, the bass coming through strange, the signal that shouldn't have been beautiful but was, and had articulated it more precisely than most music critics he'd read. He thought, there is no version of this that is simple. That's fine. Simple is overrated. Simple is a thing you want when you're afraid of nuance. Email it to the address on the station website, he said. She opened the door. I will not return to this building, she said. I know, he said. She paused in the doorway. She didn't turn around. The array will not stop me indefinitely in another location, she said. You understand that? I know that too, he said, but this isn't about stopping you indefinitely. This is about here now, these people. He paused, and you knowing that there are humans who pay attention. There have always been such humans, she said, quietly. The way you say something that is simultaneously a fact and a kind of admission. Yeah, he said, I think you maybe forgot to factor that in. He heard her go down the stairs. He heard the deliberate, careful descent, each step placed with the precision of a being who had calculated exactly how much sound it could afford to make in any given space, and had set the number at this much and no more. He heard the front door open and close. He sat in the quiet of the common room with the hum of the array running in the studio behind the closed door, with her shelf of books. She had left the books, he realized, the shelf full of scripts in unreadable languages, whether from haste or intention he couldn't say, and found he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know, and he stayed there until the building settled into its late evening sounds. The radiator ticking. The couple in 2B having a quiet argument about something small and ordinary. Deanna's television through the floor. The old man in 2C moving around his kitchen, with the particular heaviness of someone who hadn't yet recovered but would. He felt the building breathe. He went into the studio and sat down at the desk and turned on his equipment. He watched the spectrum analyzer display the frequencies of the room. He watched his own signal, steady, clean, filling the band it was meant to fill. He watched the place where her signal had been. He watched it diminish as she moved away from the building. It was visible in the analyzer, a moving source, the signal strength dropping as distance increased, the pulse growing fainter and more irregular as the space between them lengthened. It was like watching a ship move out to sea from a high point on shore, not visible directly but traceable in the data, readable in the numbers, present in the math until it wasn't. Smaller and smaller, until the baseline noise swallowed it, until the band went clean. He made a note in his phone, the time, the frequency, the date. The way it had looked when it went. He added it to the document. He updated everything, the section for Portland, what had happened, how it had resolved, what he'd built and how it had worked, the conversation at the end, her statement that the second-floor tenants would recover, her acknowledgement that she had listened to the show. He wrote all of it down in plain language. He did not know who would read it. He was a radio host with 2,000 listeners. He was not a researcher or an authority or anyone with institutional backing of any kind. But he had learned, over 4 years of sending signals into the night, that you put the thing out there. You do the work of putting it out there with as much care as you can manage. You trust the frequency. Someone is always listening, and the act of listening changes both of you. He went to his records. He pulled the Osaka Private Press from its sleeve, the album with no artist name, no label, just the hand-drawn cover. He put it on. He turned the volume up just slightly, not enough to bother anyone, just enough to fill the room the way good music fills a room, which is not with noise but with presence. He sat in the studio, and listened to the whole 42 minutes. Tuesday he did the show. He opened the way he always opened, the 15-second burst of feedback, the dive, the sound of something going under before the music comes up, and when it cleared he said, "Good evening, everybody. You're listening to the Deep Channel. Stay warm out there." He played Coltrane. He played the bootleg, the piano mic blown, the bass coming through strange, the imperfection that made it. He played it loud enough that it went through the wall into the room that was now empty, which had always been cold, which held a shelf of books and scripts he couldn't read. 3 weeks later an email arrived at the station address. No name, no subject line, just a location, an address in Tokyo, a private collector, a contact name, and below it 4 words. "The imperfection is what makes it." He sat with that for a while. He replied, "Thank you for listening." He hit send and watched the message go out into the frequency, and he thought about signals, about the things that travel through the air that nobody can see, about the vast invisible infrastructure of transmission and reception that humans had built over 2 centuries, because they had an inexhaustible need to put things out there and find out if anyone was listening. About all the ways that need had been called foolish and had turned out to be the opposite. He put on another record. He thought, "I'll keep doing the show." He thought, "Maybe she'll keep listening." He thought, in a universe full of predators and prey and frequencies nobody has mapped yet, that's actually not nothing. He thought that might even be the whole point. He let the music fill the room and go through the walls and out the window into the Portland night, gray and flat, and full of signals moving in every direction, and he stayed there until the record ended, and then he got up and made himself something to eat. The second floor recovered. It took 6 weeks. By the time the crocuses came up in the strip of soil beside the building's front steps, Deanna was moving through her day without stopping at her door. The couple in 2B had resumed their normal argument schedule with full energy on both sides, and the old man in 2C had carried a new bookcase up the stairs alone and was cursing cheerfully the whole way. Marcus heard him from the landing and smiled. He kept the document updated. He kept the array running until he felt certain she wasn't coming back, and then he decommissioned it carefully and archived the plans in the same encrypted location as everything else. Not because he thought he'd need to build it again. Because someone might. Because the thing about signals is that they travel in both directions, and you never know who is listening and what they might need from what you put out there. He did the show. He always did the show. He was still doing it 2 years later when a message came in through the station's contact form from an address he didn't recognize and said simply, "I found something in Seattle. Similar pattern. Can I send you what I have?" He replied, "Yes." He pulled up the document. He started a new section. The message from Seattle came from a woman named Priya who worked as a building manager in Capitol Hill. She had noticed the pattern herself. A cluster of tenants who had grown incrementally exhausted over a period of 4 months. No medical explanation, no shared environmental factor, no seasonal correspondence. She had started documenting because documenting was what she did. It was the habit of her profession, the reflex of someone who managed buildings for a living and understood that the unexplained was the most important category. You logged it and watched it, and eventually it told you what it was. Her tenant in the top unit had left 2 weeks earlier, abruptly, with very little notice and no forwarding address. The tenants had begun to recover. She had found his station website through a search he would never have anticipated. She'd been looking for radio interference resources, and a forum thread had mentioned his show in the context of spectrum analysis, and someone had left a comment that said, "If you want to understand how signals interact with living systems, talk to this guy." She'd clicked through to the station page. She'd sent the message. Marcus read her documentation 3 times. It was thorough. She had timestamps, she had notes on each tenant, she had photographs of the door frames. The photographs were taken from a low angle, close in, clearly lit. She'd used a flashlight to pick up the discoloration around the marks. She knew what she was looking at. She hadn't been told she'd found it. He called her on the phone. She had a calm voice and a direct way of speaking, and she had lived in Seattle her whole life. She asked good questions and did not ask for reassurance about whether she was going crazy. She had already passed through that phase and come out the other side. "How long has it been happening?" Marcus asked. "The pattern, I mean, this specific building." 4 months active, 2 weeks of recovery starting now, Priya said. "But I manage 12 buildings. I've seen similar things twice before in the past 3 years in 2 of the other properties. I didn't connect them at the time because I didn't have a framework for it." "You have one now," Marcus said. "I have the beginning of one," she said. "You have more of it than I do. That's why I'm calling." He told her what he knew. He told her about the signal, about the array he'd built, about the way it had resolved. He told her about Vel, not her name, not details he felt were his to give, but the shape of what she was and how she operated and what the pattern meant. He told her about the document. He sent her a copy. Priya read it overnight and emailed him back at 5 in the morning with 17 questions, each one specific and useful, several of them about things Marcus hadn't thought to address. He answered them over the following days. She answered his follow-up questions. They went back and forth like this for 2 weeks, building something that was more complete than what either of them had started with. On the 3rd week she said, "I think there are more of us." She meant people who had noticed. People who had seen the pattern and logged it and were sitting somewhere with a document full of information they didn't know what to do with, because the information was the kind that didn't fit anywhere in the normal order of things, and the normal order of things was very good at not making room for what didn't fit. Marcus thought about his 2,000 listeners. He thought about the signals that went out on Tuesday and Thursday nights and found the people in the dark who needed something to hold on to. He thought about Vel, somewhere out there in the frequency, having heard him say a thing into a microphone that she had found worth listening to, which meant the signal had reached further than he knew, which meant it always did. He thought, we are humans who pay attention. He thought, there is always someone else out there paying attention too. He thought, the thing we need is not weapons, and it is not institutions, and it is not official recognition. The thing we need is what we have always needed, to be connected to each other, to know there are others listening, to know that the signal reaches further than we can see. He wrote back to Priya, "I think you're right." He paused. He wrote, "I know a way to find them." He turned on the mic. "Good evening, everybody," he said. "You're listening to the Deep Channel. Tonight I want to talk about something. It's about signals. It's about paying attention. And it's about what you do when you find something out there in the frequency that doesn't fit the map you've been given." He paused. "Stay warm out there," he said. "This might take a while." He played the dive. He let it run. Then he started talking.